Welcome to Crisp Tutorials, where we keep it short, simple, and to the point. Today's topic is how can we improve the estimates in every sprint? In our previous video, we discussed how an estimation meeting should be conducted. And I told you that every developer and QA will be estimating the story. But then, on what ground, on what basis will the delivery team members estimate your story? That I'll explain you in this video. See, as I told you earlier, the first estimation occurs in sprint n minus 1. So, in sprint n minus 1, we do the estimation for the very first time. At that time, the product backlog might just contain 6 to 7 stories. Product backlog is a very live artifact. It keeps growing as and when the project continues. So, when developers are developing their stories, what do the BA and the product owner do? They are actually continuously improving the product backlog. Means they are breaking down epics into user stories, breaking down bigger user stories into smaller user stories, writing the description for those stories, adding wireframes to them. This is their job. So let's say in the very first estimation meeting, we have only 6 to 7 user stories ready in the product backlog, and the product backlog looks something like this. As you can see, it has only these 6 stories. So in that case, you won't be picking the first story for estimation. No. Of course, the product backlog is prioritized. So this story number 1 is highest in the priority, and story number 6 is the lowest in the priority. Here US means user story. Okay. So in these 6 7 stories, you should find out which is the smallest. The smallest one is, let's say, user story number 4. So your estimation sequence is like this. You will first pick user story number 4, put it as your benchmark, and say that this story is story point 2. Or if you're using t-shirt sizing, then you'll say this story is a small story. Okay. Now, mind you that we have not chosen story point 1, or we have not chosen the t-shirt size extra small. We are always keeping one level lesser available, so that in the future, if a user story comes which is even smaller than user story 4, then we may assign user story 1, story point 1, or t-shirt size extra small to it. Okay, so we are giving one slot, we are keeping one slot above. Okay, we are keeping one slot in reserve just to be future safe. And why only one slot? Why didn't we call this story as medium, or why didn't we call it like 5 story points? The reason is there is a very little possibility that you will get a story in the future which is smaller than the story which was identified in the very first sprint. Because in the first sprint, usually the first story that you pick is mostly like user should be able to navigate to the website so that he sees the landing page. That's it. So I don't think anything smaller than this can ever come in the future. And if at all something comes, then you still have you can still give it 1 story point or extra small estimation. Okay. Now, once you have estimated user story 4 as 2 story point or small, then this becomes your benchmark. Then start picking the stories one by one as per the priority. So as per the priority, user story 1 should be picked up now. Now user story 1 will be estimated considering this benchmark. Means is if this story is a 2 pointer, then compare the complexity of user story 1 with user story 4, compare the effort of user story 1 with user story 4, compare the uncertainty of user story 1 to user story 4, and then see if user story 4 is 2 point, then how many points should be given to 1. Okay. Now once you have estimated it, let's say this comes out to be a 5 story point. Then, while estimating the next story, that is user story 2, you have two benchmarks. One is user story 4 and another is user story 1. So, user story 4 is a 2 pointer, and user story 1, this type of a story, is a 5 pointer. So, let's say user story 2, then you can think it is somewhere in between both of them. So, let's give it 3. Then user story 2, 3 estimation, you have three benchmarks: 4, 1 and 2. So this time you might say, see, it is somewhat similar to user story 4. So okay, let me call it 2. Then user story 5, you have four benchmarks, these four stories. So if this type of story gets 2, this type of story gets 5, this type of story gets 3, and this type of story gets 2, then this type of story, I think it is more like story 1. So let's give it 5 2. And let's say this story is the biggest, even bigger than 1. So okay, I think a little bigger than 1. So let's give it 8. So in this way, every user at every level, you use the previously estimated stories as your benchmark. And that is why you must have heard your scrum master often say that uh, your team's estimates improve every sprint. Why? Because in the very first sprint, in the very first estimation meeting, you had a reference of only these five user stories, and this six user story got estimation depending upon these five user stories. Okay, but in the next sprint's estimation, you will have a reference of all these six user stories, and plus every story that you estimate adds your benchmark, adds your reference, so you become more and more perfect while estimating it. So this was the tip for improving estimates every sprint. And besides, I wanted to discuss this point only, that the first story to be estimated is the smallest story in the product backlog in the very first estimation meeting. And you always mention it as, or estimate it as, a two pointer or a small story. So this is what I wanted to highlight. Now, what are the points that you should consider while estimating a story? So, 3 points. One is how complex it is, another is what is the effort required, and another is what is the uncertainty with that story. So, if your architect is good and if he has groomed you well, then uncertainty should not be with respect to technology. Because if the architect starts early and he explains you the new technology even before the estimation meetings, then uncertainty won't be in your picture. Okay, so all the estimations of stories happen based on these three criteria: complexity, effort, and uncertainty. Now, what I wish to stress upon is hours is not considered while estimating the stories. So, do not look at a story in this way, that how many hours will I take to complete this story. No, this is not the way in which you should be estimating your stories. Many people might give you ideas that, if it is a five pointer story, uh, five pointer story, then it should take like 8 hours. And if it is an 8 pointer story, then it should take like 16 hours, etc. But this kind of a calculation, or this kind of a referencing that this many points means this many hours, it is absolutely rubbish. Agile does not allow this. Rather, Agile expects you to look at a story only from three perspectives: what is the complexity, what is the effort required, and is there any uncertainty? If at all, how much?